You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Have you ever visited an erotic camsite? If so, you're in good company. Surveys find that as many as 1 in 5 adults have visited one of these sites before, which has turned this into a multi-billion-dollar industry. But what are people who are visiting these sites really looking for? Is it just about sexual titillation, or does it go deeper than that? Let's talk about it. A new study of erotic camsite users finds that the people visiting these sites are often looking for emotional connection and fulfillment. So, are they actually finding it? We'll explore what the data say. We'll also discuss the extent to which people feel that the connections they have with cam models are authentic and real, and whether intimacy is truly an experience that can be commodified. I am joined once again by Ellen Kaufman, a senior research associate at the Kinsey Institute. Her research focuses on the intersection of sexuality and technology, exploring how our relationships and overall sexual and emotional well-being are shaped by new modalities of connection. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Okay, Ellen, let's talk about digital intimacy. So in recent years, erotic camsites have become quite popular. In some of the data that I was reviewing before the show, it appears that as many as 1 in 5 adults have visited an erotic campsite before. Also, the biggest sites are getting tens of millions of visitors per month, and this industry brings in billions of dollars per year. Now, before we dive into your research on the people who visit these sites and what they're really looking for and what they're getting out of them, can you tell us a little bit about what an erotic campsite is like and how it works, in case there's anybody who's not really familiar with this concept? And also, how is it different from just visiting like a straight up porn website?
Yeah, so erotic webcam modeling, or camming as it's sort of more broadly known, it's a form of digital sex work wherein models or performers are performing live for an audience that can either be tens of thousands of people or individual one-on-one interactions with a paying member of these particular websites. And so these streams or these shows that the models are performing can include all kinds of content. There are models who are performing content that is not sexual in nature, that could, feature nudity, but not be inherently sexual. There are models who are having one-on-ones where they're just having conversations with the members, but then certainly there are sexual elements as well. And there are opportunities for members to tip models or request or pay for additional experiences or services through the show. So it is interactive in that sense. There's a chat feature, so the audience can engage with the model in that way, especially in comparison to these more traditional forms of online pornography. It's synchronous and it's live and it's interactive. And that really is the thing that represents kind of like the novel aspect of camming compared to other forms of pornography.
Yeah, thanks for that description. Makes total sense. And I think helps to understand and situate this in context with the plethora of adult websites that are out there. There are so many different ways that people go online in terms of seeking sexual gratification and fulfillment, and lots of different options these days.
Absolutely.
So who is the primary audience for camsites? And just a funny side note, when I was writing the show notes before the episode, every time I wrote camsite, my AI corrected it to campsite. And I'm like, we're not talking about erotic campsites in this episode.
I'm sure that's something, but that's not my area of expertise. So I'm going to have to find somebody else for that.
I know they exist, but that's a totally separate episode. But Back to the camsites, who's the primary audience here? So do we know like the typical gender, age, or relationship status of the people who tend to use these sites?
It is predominantly cis heterosexual men. In terms of relationship status, it seems like it depends on the campsite, but it seems like actually it's relatively evenly split in terms of people who are identify as single and people who are in relationships. Age sort of ranges. I think the average age is around like 35-ish in terms of the average member on one of these sites, but it really can vary depending on the sites. There are, I should mention, sort of more specific sites in addition to the broader sites. So there are sites that are specifically aimed at like BDSM and kink communities. And so the demographics can be a little bit different in those spaces. But in general, what we're looking at is 30s-ish men who are the primary users of these platforms.
Yeah. And I think, it makes sense that the average user is going to be a little bit older than what people might be expecting. And it's because you need money to use
Right.
these sites, right? And so I think it's people with more financial means, this is more of an option for them, as opposed to if you don't have as much in the way of financial means, there's tons of free porn that you can access out there, or you can chat with a free chatbot or something along those lines. So yeah, I think this is partially income determined in terms of, who the audience is going to be for these sites.
Right. And I think it also makes sense that there is sort of, you have to be kind of in this sweet spot of like digital literacy and like digital nativism, but also, as you say, having the income to engage with these sites, because I'm sure we will talk about this, but there are sort of things that you're paying for that you're getting from these experiences that you don't get from necessarily other more traditional forms of online pornography. So the people who want those experiences are willing to pay for them.
Yeah. So you conducted a study of Camsite users that I want to discuss. But before we dive into the results, what was the main idea behind the study? What were you hoping to explore here?
So we've been conducting actually a number of studies with users of the popular camming site Live Jasmine. We've looked at a number of different areas of the experiences of both the members and the models or performers on the site. So for this particular study, what we were interested in were questions around emotional well-being and loneliness and anxiety, mental well-being, particularly in terms of the members' experiences. So we were asking them a number of questions around those aspects of their experience on the site. But one of the things that we were really interested in was the extent to which they sort of feel that these relationships that they've developed with the models are kind of authentic, how they can manage those relationships, primarily even if they are having those relationships. And one of the things that we found was that 65% of the members had ever had an emotional bond, a close emotional bond with a model. So, I mean, I think those results really speak for themselves in terms of how prevalent these types of real relationships are between the members and the models on the site.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, which was, how common is it for people to say they feel an emotional bond to a campsite model? And as you just said, it seems to be pretty common. Something else you asked about too was whether or not people felt that their emotional needs were being fulfilled. So I think the numbers, if I recall, were pretty similarly high, that it was...
Yeah, it's about 64. Yeah, 64% feel that the experiences at least somewhat emotionally fulfill them.
Yeah. So people are getting more out of campsites than just some sexual thrill or titillation. There seems to be this emotional component or emotional connection to the models on these sites. But as you alluded to previously, in looking through your qualitative data, it seems like there's this interesting tension that participants feel around the intimacy that they're experiencing. So while a lot of campsite users feel as though they have this authentic connection with the models, they're simultaneously distrustful of the model's behavior, right? It's a bit of a paradox. And it seems like there's some cognitive dissonance going on here where it's like, yeah, I have an authentic connection, but I also don't trust it, right? So tell us a little bit more about that.
There's this idea that we reference and actually was sort of like framing for this study, this idea that's referred to as bounded authenticity. And that's Elizabeth Bernstein's idea in the context of sex work broadly. And that's essentially that the experience that you have, intimacy that you have within the context of sex work is emotionally meaningful because of the kind of transactional boundary around it. So because it can't exist outside of this particular space, and because there is this transactional element where everyone understands kind of what's being exchanged here, it allows for this sort of authentic emotional intimacy to exist in that space. What we found in the study is that for a number of the members on the site, that really did describe their experience. So they felt that kind of the transactional boundaries or the even digital boundaries of these experiences allowed for them to develop what felt for them like a really authentic, meaningful relationship with these models.
So it felt real for basically the context that it was in, essentially.
Yeah, it's almost like they're being given permission to be vulnerable in this space, because almost like there are other contexts in which we facilitate transactional intimacy, for example, like a therapy session. Everybody understands what the roles are here. And so because you have showed up and provided your half of the bargain, essentially, that you understand that this is now a space where you can be emotionally vulnerable because that's essentially what you're paying for, in addition to other things that you might be getting from these experiences. It's the sense that because we have entered this sort of special transactional space, and it's really, I think, heightened by the fact that you have this distance through the technology, because we've entered this space now, I can be myself. I can be vulnerable and authentic, and I'll be listened to in an authentic way because that's what the transaction is based on.
This has me thinking about strip clubs, right? Because you have something similar that happens in a strip club environment where they're trying to create this authentic interaction or intimacy between the performers and the clients. And people who are visiting the strip club, most of them probably recognize that that connection isn't real, right? In the sense of it's not going to lead to anything further beyond what happens in the club. But it feels real enough in that moment. And I know that it's transactional, but that's okay because it's still meeting my needs, right? So I think in a strip club environment, on a campsite, also with other forms of sex work, I think it's all this same sort of idea of bounded intimacy where it's I think most people recognize all right, I know that there are limitations or restrictions on how far this can go because it's something that I'm paying for. But again, I'm okay with that. It's sort of like how we manage other forms of cognitive dissonance, where there's kind of this inconsistency between, our attitudes or behaviors or feelings. And we find a way to resolve that or to make sense of it. And then we can be at peace with it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's completely right. We saw that sort of in a number of different ways amongst the members in this study, in the sense that some of them felt like the platform as a boundary was really important. So these platforms have rules around the types of information that models can disclose to members for very obvious safety reasons. So for the members, those kind of rules became very important boundary markers for them. So they would say things like, I know that the model wants to disclose more to me, but she can't because she's not allowed to because those are the rules of the job. Or something that I found really fascinating was that some of the members would say that they feel that the intimacy that they experience with the model is real because the model will tell them about their interactions with other members and the work that they're doing. And so it's kind of like a peek behind the curtain there. So because that experience feels more authentic, even though it acknowledges the work that goes into this and the sort of boundaries around this work, because they're being shown the other side of it, that makes the experience feel authentic to them. But I think to the point that you've made before, I do feel that there's a sort of a tacit acknowledgement on the part of many of these members that there are limitations to these interactions, but it doesn't mean that they're not meaningful.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that they're not, as we see from the number of people, the majority of members here who feel that their needs are being somewhat fulfilled emotionally, we're finding that it meets the mark. Just because it isn't exactly the form of intimacy that we might think of as existing in these sort of non-transactional interpersonal relationships, it doesn't mean it's not meaningful.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if I'm remembering your results correctly, I think users kind of fell into two camps, right? So there were the users who recognized that, this is bounded intimacy. It is what it is. It's what I'm paying for, and it's meaningful, and it, works within this particular context for me. But there were also people who felt like their relationships with the models transcended the financial transaction, that it could potentially even lead to a real world connection or a real world relationship. So tell us a little bit more about that for people who kind of saw the relationship that they had with the Camsite model as being more fluid, more flexible than those who saw it as being very bounded.
Yeah, I think for those people, interestingly, the boundaries still kind of exist, but I think from their perspective, the boundaries are sort of the last obstacle that's keeping that relationship from existing. So as I mentioned, there are people who are saying things like that they know that the rules around the platform means that the model can't fully disclose things about her life or, what her true feelings are. This is sort of how they described it, but also that they believe that they would be able to have a relationship offline with the model. If they met in person, that the relationship could be completely replicated. And so it's really just the fact that they are engaging in this relationship that they met in this particular digital space that means that they can't be together in person, which is, I think, falls in line with a lot of the romantic tropes that we see broadly around relationships, transactional or not, that tension is something that is really meaningful in lots of relationships from a sexual perspective, romantic perspective. And so I think they really feel that they've connected with the model reciprocally in a way that could be replicated, in the real world if it was possible, if they didn't have these challenges of, the platform, her work requirements, all of those things.
So interesting. And I think in some cases it might be people just kind of telling themselves their fantasy that they have that, of
Sure,
course,
yeah.
we would have connected in the real world had we only met in the real world instead of having met online. It really is interesting how people justify or rationalize some of the interactions that they have on these sites. Let's talk about low libido. If you've ever looked for a supplement in the hopes of giving yours a little boost, you know what a minefield it can be. There are so many options, and some of them contain really questionable ingredients. It's a market that's notorious for products that are underdosed, ineffective, or in some cases, just downright shady. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Drive Boost from VB Health. VB Health has changed the game by focusing on what truly matters: trust and transparency. Imagine a libido supplement formulated by doctors, one that's rigorously third-party tested for purity and potency, so you know exactly what you're getting. And it's made with care in the USA. That's Drive Boost. This supplement is also unique because it's formulated for both men and women. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin to get 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. A bad mattress can be bad for your intimate life. Trust me. Our old mattress was not good for our relationship. It was making us too hot at night and hurting our sleep, and we'd wake up in the morning not feeling refreshed and at our best. And when you're always feeling tired and cranky, that's not a recipe for intimacy. But we found Brooklyn Bedding, and things are in a much better place now. Brooklyn Bedding uses Glaciotex covers and Copperflex foam to help keep you cool and comfortable all night long. We're both sleeping more soundly now and not waking up early in a pool of sweat. Brooklyn Bedding is one of the few mattress brands endorsed by the American Chiropractic Association for spinal alignment and back health, and I understand why, because I'm no longer waking up with aches and pains. So if you want to upgrade your sleep, check out Brooklyn Bedding, where you can try a 120-night comfort trial. If you don't love it, they'll help you return or swap it hassle-free. Go to brooklynbedding.com and use my promo code Justin at checkout to get 30% off site-wide. This offer is not available anywhere else. That's brooklynbedding.com and promo code Justin for 30% off site-wide. Make sure you enter our show name after checkout so they know we sent you. brooklynbedding.com, promo code Justin. Now, to my knowledge, you didn't collect data on the psychological profiles of users, but I would venture a number of predictions about how things like loneliness or attachment style might impact the user experience. So, for example, someone who is more avoidantly attached might find this kind of bounded intimacy to be appealing because they can get close to someone without getting too close, right? Because we know for avoidantly attached people, there's kind of this fear of intimacy. And so having it occur in this kind of controlled environment might be particularly appealing to someone who's a little bit more on the avoidant end of the spectrum. Now, by contrast, somebody who is more anxiously attached might be more likely to think that that connection is real, and they keep coming back to the site to seek reassurance from the model that that connection that they have is real. So I'm curious, do you have any data or any thoughts on how things like attachment style or personality might factor into all of this and the experiences that people have on these sites?
I think your assessment is spot on. And we unfortunately didn't collect any data specifically about attachment style, but I do think what you were saying kind of like sparked something for me in terms of some of the data that we have already collected and is sort of just like waiting for us. It's like one of the next things that we're going to be looking at has to do with breakups between members and models, people who identify as being in a relationship with one of the models. In the study that we've been referencing, we do have some of the qualitative data there about the experiences of people who have breakups with the models, and what they describe is really something that is so tremendously similar sounding to what a relationship breakup, outside of this transactional boundary or transactional context would look like, in the sense that it's emotionally devastating to them. And they really feel that they have, lost a partner in the same way that they would if it were outside of this transactional boundary. But one of the things that I'm really interested in sort of digging through our new data to look for is the sense that, unlike in a interpersonal relationship that exists in the real world, there are breakups that look a little bit different, in the sense that we've had members say that, they logged on to talk to their favorite model and she wasn't on the website anymore. And they just sort of like completely lost her in a way that is, I think, certainly ghosting exists in the real world. That's possible. That can happen to you in real life. But it's a kind of reminder of the nature of the website and the nature of these relationships that I think is very emotionally complex, and it has implications that sort of go beyond, especially psychologically, that go beyond this particular transactional context, for sure.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. I hadn't even thought about, these digital breakups with CAM models and all the different ways that breakup could occur. And, as you mentioned, the model just not being on the website anymore could be one form of breakup. And there could be any number of reasons for that. Maybe the model got suspended from the site for violating terms and conditions. Maybe the model just decided she didn't want to do it anymore, or he, or, depending on whatever gender the model is. Or it could also be maybe the model started a relationship and maybe their partner wasn't comfortable with them being a CAM model. And so, there could be any number of factors in terms of like why someone might stop performing webcam modeling. And then that leaves the user in this situation of, they're feeling ghosted and they have like no closure and it's totally uncertain. And you can see how that could create a lot of anxiety, especially if 2/3 of them are feeling an emotional bond with this performer. But it could also be the case, this happens sometimes, is that the models will sometimes break it off with certain users who get maybe a little bit too intrusive with their questions, or trying to pressure them to, move conversation off of the platform or things like that. And so a breakup could also occur in that way. You could also have breakups because somebody falls on hard economic times and can no longer afford to visit and pay the model, right? And so there can be all kinds of different ways that the quote unquote breakup happens. And so it would be interesting to really delve into the nuances there and see if the different circumstances or conditions, how those are related to distress, and then also how attachment style factors into all of this. So many fascinating questions to ask here.
Yeah, well, that's next. So I'll come back someday and tell you more about that. But we're really interested in what that looks like, because I think that's one of the areas where I think there are a lot of assumptions around these relationships that don't really reflect those dynamics. And in fact, what we know, at least from some of this earlier data, is that these relationships really do feel real, and the relationship breakups really do feel real for a lot of these members.
Yeah. So in the last episode, we were talking all about AI and dating and relationships, and how there are a lot of people who feel that, using AI would represent cheating to the extent that you're developing some kind of sexual or romantic connection with someone else. And I think there's something similar here with use of camsites in the context of somebody who has a real world romantic relationship. Many people would consider their partner talking to a CAM model, tipping a CAM model, or even just visiting a camming website as being cheating or infidelity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really where we talked about what are the sort of novel elements of this type of work and these platforms. And that's where that synchronous and kind of direct and potentially intimate aspect of these technologies really does kind of introduce new questions around are these, authentic emotional relationships? Would that be considered infidelity? I think certainly many people would consider engaging directly with a CAM model as opposed to sort of like watching a show passively as infidelity. But again, these are things that I think really will vary depending on what someone's perspective towards digital sexual technologies is broadly. But I think certainly the fact that there are these potential emotional connections that are being formed does have implications for whether it's perceived as infidelity or not.
Yeah, we did a study recently at the Kinsey Institute in conjunction with datingadvice.com. And we asked people about a whole bunch of different things that they considered to be cheating in their relationships. And we actually found that using camsites, people rated that as being more likely to be cheating than using, an AI chatbot to sext with, right? And so I think having the actual human connection here is something that makes people a little bit more uncomfortable because they might worry that, well, that could lead to an actual in-person affair or interaction. And so there are a lot of people who are more concerned about, camming sites as opposed to AI when it comes to things like cheating and infidelity. But it goes back to what we were talking about in the last episode, which is that I think there's a lot of fear of the unknown here because, most people haven't used a cam site before. A heck of a lot of people have, but most people haven't. And I think a lot of people might just naturally assume that, well, if they're cultivating emotional connections on here, then it's going to lead to something further down the road.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, so one of the ways in which this research, both of these areas has kind of diverged is that we also collected data around potential AI cam models. So this would be essentially AI generated models that would perform the same work that a human model would on these platforms. And one of the really interesting things that we found is that amongst members who have these experiences with the cam models, there is not a lot of interest in an AI model, even though an AI model could potentially be, sort of exactly what you're looking for in terms of personality and physical appearance and all the things that the algorithms are already doing work to help you find the human model who you're going to connect to in that way. But we found that sort of in general, these members are not interested in these technologies, that they don't think that could replicate either the sexual or the emotional experiences that they're having with the cam models. And actually, really interestingly, most of the users said that they would pay more to talk to a human model than to an AI cam model. To sort of come back to this infidelity piece, it really speaks to the experiences that they're having at the heart of these interactions and what they're not having with AI, which is that there is this benefit to this intangible, even if it is bounded in a sense by the transaction. There is something potentially real that's happening when you interact with a person that's just not possible with an AI cam model or companion that I think people recognize, at least people who have these really powerful emotional experiences with the human cam models. That just doesn't appeal to them to be sort of switching over to an AI model.
Yeah. And what you're saying there is one of the big reasons why I don't think AI and technology is going to replace in-person human relationships. It's because people want that human element, that connection. And I know that the technology will continue to get better and it over time will become even more similar to our interactions with humans. But there's still something about knowing that you're talking to a real person as opposed to a bot that just makes people feel more comfort, safety, security, bondedness, whatever it is that you want to insert there. There's something unique about it that I just don't think technology is going to quite be able to replicate, at least not for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think it's also tension. I think that's a real spark in these relationships that we have with other humans, is that there's always this possibility that this person could say yeah, actually, I don't want to be in a relationship with you anymore. I'm ready to, explore new things. But for relationships where that's not the case, this person is actively saying I want to be in a relationship with you. I'm choosing to do this. And that element of free will is something that just obviously doesn't exist in the context of AI. And as you say, we may get to the point where AI is able to provide the appearance of that in a very, very effective way. I think there's already been a number of media pieces where people have interacted with ChatGPT or any of these platforms and been really blown away by how sentient appearing these technologies are. But I think it really is important that we are always grounding ourselves in a place of reality around what's actually happening here, what the technology is doing and why it's able to appear that way, and really how that speaks much more to what we're willing to believe as opposed to what this technology is able to do. For people who have had experiences with interpersonal relationships, especially meaningfully intimate ones, I think that it will certainly be more challenging for AI to replicate those experiences. What I am more interested in, or at least what I think is something that we should, keep an eye on, is that in the study that we referenced in the last episode, 33% of Gen Z folks have, had an experience with an AI companion. And some of those people probably don't have any experience in terms of long-term or meaningfully intimate relationships with other people. And so I think what's important with that group of people, or even, younger generations of people who are kind of coming up on this technology, is, will these AI companion relationships be sort of their first meaningful intimate relationships? And what would that mean in terms of how it informs what they think about human relationships and what human relationships are supposed to be like? I think that's really the space where the appeal is there, and that may sort of change or shape their expectations in a way that maybe we feel is not ultimately beneficial to interpersonal relationships forming outside of these spaces.
Yeah, I think you're so right. In terms of the current overall population, I think there's a cap in terms of how many people are going to be willing to engage in, AI or technology-based relationships. But for younger people, as that sort of becomes the norm, and I think, increasingly we're going to see that from younger and younger generations, then that cap is going to increase in the population again, as that sort of becomes a more normative behavior. So I think that's where the real potential is to see a big shift. But I still think that's some ways down the line. But this has been a truly fascinating conversation, Ellen. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I am still on formerly Twitter, and I'm going to continue to call it that, at ELMKAUF, at Elmkauf. That's the best place to find updates on my work, or you can follow me on LinkedIn, although I don't check that very often. That's just an important caveat. But I do post research there as well. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been so wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I'll be sure to include links to that in the show notes. So I really appreciate your time. Great to speak with you, Ellen, and I look forward to having you back in the future to talk more about your evolving work on digital intimacy. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.